Well, we're going to start this walking tour of Worthington. We're at the corner of Oxford and New England, and we're going to talk about African American history in Worthington to help memorialize the Juneteenth celebration today. So we'll talk first a little bit about the Civil War. The Civil War began with the Confederate soldiers when they bombarded Union soldiers at Fort Sumter, South Carolina on April 12, 1861. The war ended in spring 1865. Robert E. Lee surrendered the last major Confederate army to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The last battle was fought at Palmyra Ranch, Texas, May 13, 1865. So then, the historical legacy of Juneteenth. On Freedom's Eve, or the eve of January 1st, 1863, so the middle of the Civil War, the first watch night services took place on that night. Enslaved and free African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country, and private homes all across the country waiting news that the Emancipation Proclamation has taken effect. At the stroke of midnight, prayers were answered, and all enslaved people in the Confederate States were declared legally free. Union soldiers, many of whom were black, marched into plantation across the cities in the South, reading small copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, spreading the news of freedom in Confederate states. Only through the 13th Amendment did emancipation end slavery throughout the United States. But not everyone in Confederate territory would immediately be free. So that was in '63 when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. But as we just heard, the Civil War didn't end to '65, and the last battle wasn't to the end in May in Texas. So as a result, in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people would not be free until much later. Freedom finally came on June 19th, after the last battle in May of 1865, when some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas. The Army announced that more than 250,000 enslaved black people in the state were free by executive decree. This day became known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. So we're going to take a pocket site tour that is produced by the Worthington Historical Society and start 1856 at the Turk Family home, 108 West New England Avenue. On April 3rd, 1856, when Charles and Lucy Wiley and Nathan and Sarah Mason sold this property to Henry and Dolly Turk, they were doing something historic. The deed indicated Henry Turk had paid us the full consideration described as the premises on which the said Henry Turk now resides, and indicated we have given up his notes. The Turks, who were both enslaved in Virginia and could neither read nor write, had now become the first black couple to own their own home in the middle of Worthington. The Turks had been renting the house for some time, perhaps as early as 1840, when Wiley took a mortgage on the property. A June 11, 1881 issue of the newspaper Independent Observer of Worthington and Dublin stated, Aunt Dolly Turk, an estimable colored lady of this place, was interred at the cemetery last Sunday. She was formerly a slave in the state of Virginia, where in the year of 1838 she was purchased by her husband Harry Turk, and they immediately came to Worthington, where she has resided up to the time of her death. Our citizens remember her as a good and kind-hearted woman. Several of the Turk children also lived here with their aging parents. So it's this house right here, and we're going to walk up New England because we have other things. I'll keep on reading this as we go, but in the aspect of time, we're going to keep on walking. And so there is no sidewalk on this side of New England. There's the Turk house. We're going to cross the street when it's safe, and I'll keep on reading about the Turk family as we get to High Street. Several of the Turk children also lived here with their aging parents. Preston Turk is listed as an 1878 directory as a barber in the rear of the Union Hotel, now known as the Worthington Inn. Daughter Amanda Turk was briefly married to Nero Monroe, who owned land In the Monroe edition, the families who assisted the Turks purchase their home were active members of the Worthington Methodist Episcopal Church, now the Worthington United Methodist Church, a force behind the Underground Railroad in the Worthington area in the years prior to the Civil War. The Wileys and Masons were Methodists living their faith. Years before the Civil War, they were not aspiring to assist the Turks to Canada or contribute money for their passage to Liberia, but welcoming them into Worthington, making it possible for them to buy a home. It is a contrast to the atmosphere that developed as a reaction to the Great Migration of Southern blacks starting in 1916. During the 1920s and 1930s, new housing developed such as Riverly, Colonial Hills, Medic states had restrictive covenants preventing people of color from purchasing homes in the neighborhoods. The clause in the Colonial Hills abstracts reads, "No part of said Colonial Hills district or any building thereon shall be owned, leased, or occupied by any person other than one of the Caucasian race, but this prohibition shall not exclude or prevent occupancy by persons not of the Caucasian race as domestic servants of any resident of said Colonial Hills district, and the declaration of any court of the invalidity of any part of this prohibition shall not invalidate the remainder thereof." Worthington was no longer a sleepy rural town, but becoming a commuter suburb. Expansion brought new residents and new attitudes. In her interview in 2013 for WOSU's Worthington episode of Columbus Neighborhoods, Juanita Jones remarked, "I would like to say that at first, the Worthington community had no problem with race. People of different colors lived all over the area. But then, as the builders came in, then they started to say they were not selling to blacks, and that made a problem. Some of the older whites, as well as the blacks, said, 'What do you mean? It's always been an open community.'" Another longtime Worthington community member, Rosanna Fields, continued, "There were few objections when we moved into Worthington Estates, even though my husband had been born in Worthington, but the objections that we found out were from people who had moved in recently. They were not from Old Worthington. Unlike the Turks, who were able to purchase a home in the heart of Worthington with the help from the community, or blacks who owned land and homes in the Morris Edition, which we'll visit. People of color looking to own new homes in the 1900s are far more likely to encounter purposeful exclusion." All right. So we're going to the William Harrison Hotel Central, which is also known as the Worthington Inn. Frank Corbin, who lived through the 1900s in Worthington, wrote, "No conversation of the black community in Worthington past would be complete without some mention of William Harris. When he first loomed into my field of recognition, which would be about 1910-11, when I was getting out of dresses." They did that to boys in those days. William Harris knew horses and thought of Lexington, Kentucky green fields and embellishing foals when one thought of Bill. I never knew what his marital status or whether he had any family. It was his knowledge of horses that led him to George Van Loon, the proprietor of Central Hotel, Worthington Inn, or vice versa. Van Loon was well known in this setting for the best table in Franklin County and operating a livery stable, a large barn in the rear of the premises, and also had contacts. So here we are at the Worthington Inn. We're going to sit at this table over here while we read the rest of this. So we have a nice little patio. It's not really public, but we're going to make it public. Franklin County and operating a live livery stable, a large... Hey!